Okay, so good morning, good evening to wherever everyone is around the world. Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar on Indigenous data sovereignty and evidence-based policy making in the context of Australia and New Zealand. Thank you for joining from across the globe. I know the time change isn't ideal. We're early morning over here in Paris and quite late over in Australia and New Zealand. So really appreciate everyone joining to listen in and especially to our panelists today. And for those who can't join, the session will also be recorded and posted on our website and we'll post the link to that in the chat. So after the call, feel free to share that with colleagues and to revisit the discussion as well. So we'll start with some opening remarks, which will be followed by a short keynote presentation and then a panel discussion with a Q&A. So please feel free at any time during the call to post in the chat and we can discuss your questions during the panel. So just to kick things off, I will hand over to Enrique Garcilaso, who is the head of the Rural Development Unit at the OECD for the opening remarks. Thanks, Enrique.
Thank you, Bridget. And also from my side, I wanted to welcome everybody to participating in today's webinar titled Indigenous Data Sovereignty, the Future of Evidence-Based Policy in Australia and New Zealand. It's a very keen topic for us. We're very happy to have it and host it and hear from the panelists. It's one that we started some years ago when here at the OECD we developed the first thematic report on Indigenous development related issues in 2019. A report that I'm going to show here in case you see it. It's called Linking Indigenous Communities with Regional Development, and it's one that covers virtually all OECD countries with some Indigenous people. So we try to develop this first thematic report, and in addition to that, we had three country case studies, one in Canada, Sweden, and Australia. And in fact, the first chapter of that thematic report is titled Indigenous Economic Development and Well-Being, Statistics and Data Governance. So I think, that already at that time we had a sort of like some understanding of the importance, not just of producing data, but also in terms of managing and governance and the sovereignty of it. So we really understand that there are some challenging and contentious topics within this subject, and I think it's extremely relevant for both national policymakers but also Indigenous communities to deepen a little bit the knowledge on this topic. So I'm happy we're going to be zooming in the discussion today in Australia and New Zealand. And just for those of you that attend our dialogues for the first time, since we did that thematic report, we've been trying to deepen also the work around Indigenous communities with the topic on mining. We've done quite some work with Indigenous communities in a mining context, developing a certain topics in relation to that. And since the thematic report, we've also been trying to do these dialogues around different topics that are relevant to Indigenous communities. So if you're interested, feel free to sign with us and follow some of these dialogues. They are recorded. You can also go back and see a little bit how we're trying to promote and engage. And of course, from our side, we want to give the space for Indigenous people to learn from your experience, to also give the space to convey some important messages for policymakers across different OECD member countries. Without further ado, I'm just going to briefly introduce the three panels that we have today with us. As Bridget mentioned, our first keynote speaker, Lisa Pizzoni. She's the founder from Indigenous Data Authority from New Zealand. Our second speaker is Siddharth Sidokar, Chief Economist from Indigenous Business Australia. And our third speaker is Stephen Renata, Managing Director of Kiwi Digital New Zealand. So without further ado, I'll just give the floor to Lisa. Please start us off. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that. Kia ora koutou. I just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion. Across the OECD, there is a strong commitment to evidence-based policy. Data is central to how decisions are made, how outcomes are measured, and how impact is evaluated. But there's a critical issue we need to address, and what happens when the data that informs policy is not governed by the people that it represents. Because for Indigenous peoples, data is not just information, it is whakapapa, genealogy, whenua, land, identity, and lived experience. And yet, across Australia, Aotearoa, and globally, policy continues to rely on data systems that do not recognise Indigenous authority. We're not dealing with data gap, we're dealing with governance gap. Across multiple jurisdictions, we continue to see data collected without meaningful ongoing consent, interpreted outside of cultural and community context, and used to inform policy decisions without Indigenous authority over its application. This creates a structural imbalance where policy is informed by systems that exclude the very people it's designed to serve. I want to ground this in something real. My son has a cultural tattoo, a mataora, on his face. It represents his whakapapa, his genealogy, his identity, his connection to our people. That image, if captured, shared, or used within a data system, is not just a photo, it is Indigenous data. It carries meaning, context, and cultural authority. But in most systems today, if that image is taken, whether through social media, documentation, or even research, it can be stored, analysed, and reused without any recognition of that authority. There is no mechanism that says this data has cultural significance, that it has conditions of use, or that it requires consent beyond the point of capture. The system simply treats it as data, and that is the problem. Because the issue is not whether data exists, it is whether the system recognizes the authority attached to it. If that same image belonged to a corporation, it would be protected as intellectual property. When it belongs to Indigenous persons, it is often treated as freely available. So the question is not how we include Indigenous perspectives in data. The real question is how we recognise Indigenous authority within the systems that govern data. Because inclusion without authority is still extraction. What we're now seeing, and what I have been implementing through the Indigenous Data Authority, is a structural shift. Governance embedded upstream. This means authority, consent, and conditions of use are defined before data is collected, before systems are designed, and before policy is informed. This is not theoretical. We are already seeing this model applied in practice. In one implementation, data collection processes have been redesigned so that Indigenous defined governance conditions are attached at the point of collection, meaning the data cannot be used outside those conditions without breaching system level controls. In another, regional data systems have been structured so that Indigenous representatives hold decision rights over how data is interpreted and applied in policy settings, not advisory roles, but authority. And in a separate case, data sharing between agencies is governed by predefined Indigenous authority protocols, where access is conditional, not assumed. Across all of these, the shift is consistent. Governance is not applied after the fact, it is built into the systems itself. And this is the part that is often misunderstood. There is an assumption that embedding governance like this is quite a complex thing, or it requires an entirely new system. It does not. I'm not a technical developer, but I have spent a significant amount of time speaking with people who build these systems. And consistently, the response has always been the same. It is a relatively simple integration. In many cases, it can be implemented through structured metadata, permission layers, or governance rules embedded into existing architectures. It does not require rebuilding systems. It is not disruptive to existing environments. What it requires is a decision to recognize that authority should be embedded into the systems, not added later as policy or guidance. So the barrier here is not technical capability, it is prioritization. For policymakers, particularly at regional or subnational levels, this translates into practical shifts. Moving from consultation to co-governance and data system design, embedding Indigenous defined indicators and context into data sets. Ensuring that data access and use are conditional on Indigenous authority frameworks. Because without these shifts, place-based policy cannot genuinely reflect place. Through the Indigenous Data Authority, this approach has been formalised into certifiable, enforceable governance infrastructure. This enables authority to be recognised within systems, governance to be auditable and enforceable, and harm to be identified and stopped before it occurs. This is what moves Indigenous data sovereignty from principle to operational reality. The future of evidence-based policy is not just more data, it is data governed with authority, data that is defined with the communities that it represents within agreed conditions and accountable at every stage of its life cycle. If we continue to build policy on data systems that exclude Indigenous authority, we will continue to produce outcomes that fall short, no matter how advanced the data. But where governance is embedded upstream, we're already seeing a different outcome. More accurately, more accurate policy, greater trust, systems aligned with lived reality, because the future of policy is not just evidence-based, it is authority-based. It is our data, it is our authority, and it is our future. Kia ora koutou katoa.
Many thanks, Lisa, for that interesting presentation. I think it really sets the scene for the discussion that we will be having today. And so I'd like to move now to a more broader panel with the three of you discussing some of the topics on this governance gap that you've mentioned and embedding these practices early on in the data collection process. But first, maybe we can kick off the panel discussion by introducing our other two panelists. So Stephen Renata from Kiwa Digital and Siddharth Shidokar from Indigenous Business Australia. Perhaps you would both like to introduce yourselves. Maybe we can start with Stephen.
Kia ora koutou, or Stephen Renata toka wengwa. I'm the Managing Director at Kiwa Digital, based here in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, New Zealand. Our work sits across the language, culture, technology and governance, and a big part of that is helping communities and organisations manage their cultural knowledge, language content and digital assets in a way that protects the provenance, the permissions and the community authority. As a panel member today, I'm probably the least policy-based because our company actually creates the tools that deliver the policy. So I'm going to try and stay in my lane, and Lisa's set up a very, very good foundation of the narrative, which we violently agree with. And I'll add in some Kiwa stuff at the appropriate point a little bit later. Kia ora.
Thank you, Stephen. And Siddharth, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Bridget, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this panel. My name is Siddharth Shirodkar. I'm a Principal Economist at Indigenous Business Australia. I'm dialing in from Darug country, which is in Western Sydney in Australia. I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and have the honour and privilege to raise a beautiful family there. In terms of the work that we do at Indigenous Business Australia, we provide capital to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families who are looking for opportunities to aspire to build wealth, to create jobs for their communities, and to grow the Indigenous economy. And a large part of what we do, certainly not our core business, our core business is in lending and in providing financial services to First Nations people, but we also engage in data collection and research and analysis. And so this issue around First Nations data sovereignty is quite a big one. It's one that we take quite seriously at Indigenous Business Australia. The fundamentals of it are enshrined in a framework for governance of Indigenous data, which the Australian National Indigenous Australians Agency introduced a few years ago. And that's a very useful a bit of governance framework for guiding thinking for how public servants look at and view and use data, particularly when it comes to First Nations people. And I think, and we'll certainly touch on this, but criticality for me are two conflicts that are often at tension when you're working in government. One is protection of privacy and people's data, but then empowerment and ceding authority, as Lisa was putting it so eloquently, letting go of your own authority as a government agency and supporting First Nations communities to have that authority and to really drive the legitimacy of more and more of our analysis and data gathering activities. So with that, I'll leave it at that, and I think we can open up to questions.
Thank you, Sid. That's a great start as well, setting the groundwork for the discussion. Stephen, I know you had potentially a video that maybe you wanted to share with us. Would you still like to play that? Maybe we can do that now and then have some discussion. That's great. Thank you. I don't think we can hear. Maybe you're muted.
The Ngāti Paki, Ngāti Rehia subtribes, and I'm the co-owner and managing director here at Kiwi Digital. So there's about 7,200 languages worldwide. 40% of those are at risk on any given day. We're losing about one language every 40 days. The mission here is to help bridge cultural divides, help Indigenous groups preserve their knowledge and amplify the Indigenous voice using technology and making sure that we maintain the cultural integrity in that process.
We're here in Northland, so this is Kaikohe, and our hapu descends from Tūtaururu, and unfortunately not all of us can actually walk on it, and some people don't even know where the marae is. You know, for me, that's a great loss. So how we get them back there, knowledge is power. That's the first thing. So holding your own knowledge and being able to empower your people with it, and then being able to tell the stories the way that you want to.
So what we're doing now, looking at the future with AI and CultureQ and all of that, we're just continuing that mahi, we're continuing that navigation into the future. It's building a great foundation for all the kids below me. It's enabling them to have all these tools and have all of our history and our knowledge in one place so that they can be empowered to make really bold decisions in the future.
CultureQ, it's an AI-powered platform that's designed to help Indigenous groups collect, preserve, and share their cultural data and narrative. From AWS, they bring that global capability that can be localized. From a custom-D perspective, of the many things I've helped us with is the ethical AI.
So Coach Q and Caitlin talk to each other. Caitlin is a ethical and private AI system. We like to call it a kaitiaki, a guardian. And what it does is it looks at the knowledge base that these communities are building for themselves. So it doesn't look at the internet, it only learns from the knowledge base that it's given. That means you can make it its own identity and understand tikanga and respect, and it can understand cultural practices.
AWS has been with us probably since about 2018. They've helped us to create a very secure platform. It's all about that data sovereignty and that protection of the assets. The other good thing with AWS is Bedrock. We get to test the latest levels of Bedrock and the performance on that. And we're able to deploy that to all of our clients in one button press. Our developers love it. It's very easy to access and very easy to update.
So every community, every whānau, every hapu, every tribe, every mob, every First Nations group have their own stories, their own approach, their own worldviews. So if we were able to think about our whakapapa genealogy, all those nations, reconnect those with their aspirations, with the new technology, anything's possible.
Thank you, Stephen. That was a great introduction to the work that you're doing. So now it would be good to get into the discussion with our three panelists. I think we'll start with Sid. You were speaking about your work at IBA, and so maybe to start us off, you can describe to us some of the kind of concrete main challenges that you find with collecting and using Indigenous data, and the framework that you mentioned in Australia. Where do you feel that it works for you as someone creating these initiatives for Indigenous businesses, and where do you face some challenges or see some improvements that could be made?
Sure. So we do. We've built up over the last couple of years internal research and evaluation capability. So the research is done more broadly on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander economic issues, including housing and home ownership, business ownership, and we've also forayed into questions around the demographic dividend associated with the high First Nations population growth rate and the implications for Australian productivity longer term. And then we've undertaken a fair bit of work looking at our impact, so undertaking impact evaluations. And this is all a mixture of qualitative and quantitative information. And as you can imagine, the richest information comes from taking a mixed methods approach. From our perspective, though, that creates a lot of questions and challenges, not just from a qualitative perspective, but also from a quantitative perspective. So what are the data sources that we're drawing upon? What are we using to be able to appropriately and adequately tell the stories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? One of the key sources of data that we utilise is the Australian census, which is collected every 5 years. And that's probably the richest and most valuable data set, but obviously not updated fairly regularly. So we undertake our own data collections as well, primarily around our customer base, but also more broadly. Now, how do we do this? How do we undertake this work? And for us, the criticality of the framework that I spoke about before is that we make sure whatever research we do, it is done with First Nations partners first and foremost. So we do it jointly. It's not just on an advisory basis. We do have advisory panels that we bring on board to inform and guide our thinking for our research projects, and they are principally First Nations led. but we also make sure that we partner with a First Nations organisation where we can to be able to undertake the work with us. And that's really quite critical, because we know, like myself, I was born in India and I've grown up in Australia. I do not have a First Nations perspective myself. And I know that'll be that's just a deficiency of not being part of the community. But to pay appropriate respect and to make sure that the insights that we draw from any information we're looking at is appropriately grounded. We work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and businesses and research organisations, but we also make sure that we partner with staff internally within IBA who come from First Nations backgrounds. So we have established a research arm where dedicated research team with First Nations and non-First Nations staff. And so we're also making sure our internal thinking is calibrated appropriately. We go through ethics processes, particularly when it comes to qualitative research and insights, but we try to, I guess you could say, undertake an internal ethics approach, which is centered around making sure the data is collected in an appropriate way, that it does no harm, but it actually also empowers. And so we once we've undertaken the research, we make sure that we provide that information back to the communities who we collected that from, so that they're aware about how the data is being utilised and what it says more broadly. And we calibrate, and if people are hesitant about sharing their information and their data, then we would obviously take it off the list. And I think that speaks to something that can be quite difficult, particularly for government agencies to do, and that is let go of the control that they have over the information that they've collected. That's a very challenging thing for governments to do anywhere in the world. But to be able to seed that ground, I think, is quite critical. It requires a discipline. As principally a quantitative researcher, I just love getting into the data and going nuts with it, and exploring all of these different avenues and these connections and relationships between different data sets. But you kind of have to take a step back and then calibrate your thinking and make sure that whatever you're doing, whatever you're producing, is aligned and provides the right kinds of insights that can help empower. Obviously, we want truth. We're looking for truth, but truth can be painted in so many ways. So how about we paint that truth in an empowering way? So that's the direction that we come from when we're thinking about data sovereignty.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And you mentioned the difficulty for governments to relinquish the control in the data collection, and I think part of that is because obviously to create evidence-based policy, the best thing to use is accurate data, and so what would your perspectives or advice be on how you can kind of balance this protection of Indigenous data sovereignty with being able to create evidence-based policy and use the data? And I'm sure you have experiences from your work of maybe frustrations where you are lacking some data and you can't access it. And so how do you bridge that gap in practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, Bridget. I think from my perspective, it's firstly around like taking your ego out of it. So I'm a researcher as well as a policy person. I've worked in government for the last 20 years, but also in academia as well. And sometimes like that first step, which is letting go of your own kind of natural instincts in this space, that's quite challenging. And it's not like you can establish a framework that can really enable that. It's about people standing up and saying, no, I'm not going to explore down that pathway, because either the partners that I'm working with have told me, look, this is not necessarily the right thing to look at, or you're looking at it through the wrong lens. And I guess challenging one's or one's own biases and perceptions is really quite critical. And it comes down to doing what good researchers should do, which is challenging one's own assumptions, not just other people's. So, I mean, I don't know if I've answered your question as fulsomely as you might like, but I think as a first step, it's important to let go of some of that ego that drives a lot of the knowledge gathering that happens in the research space and in the policy space.
Okay, and maybe the other panelists have a perspective on balancing this kind of need for data with maybe an inability to access it for policymakers to protect the Indigenous data sovereignty. How do you see this issue? Maybe Lisa?
I definitely have an opinion.
Please go
I
ahead.
definitely have an opinion. So, from the Indigenous Data Authority perspective, our kind of foundation level is number one, when people talk about an Indigenous lens, it kind of makes it sound like it's optional. If data is coming from Indigenous people and it affects Indigenous people, then it shouldn't be a lens, it should be a foundation. And I think when you start talking about having, kind of taking ego out of research and data and stuff like that, I think everybody can agree that a lot of issues that happen between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is the foundational understanding of what the data means to Indigenous people. And so that's what I have seen as being quite a massive issue. So part of the certification process that we have come up with the governance framework, etc., is so both Indigenous and non-Indigenous organisations will, through that process, have a foundational level and knowledge that is equal to each other. So what I mean is, like I say about my son's mata ora tattoo. So to people down the street, it might look like a facial tattoo. But it holds, in the context in which it's meant, it holds a lot of mana and history and whakapapa genealogy. But without that understanding, you couldn't possibly process that data in a way that it needs to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so this kind of framework or checklist, let's say, provides a guideline, at least for policymakers, to not make the mistake of misrepresenting the data.
Just having the absolutely. So it's not just about the authority over the data, it's the understanding, the understanding that data is relational, not just to a person, but to the land, to the river. Like data is not neutral. It is never neutral. It actually holds context to the people, the place, the land. And so without that depth of understanding, then we don't believe that it can be utilised in a way that is culturally safe for Indigenous peoples.
Could I just add to that point around context? I mean, it's so critical. The context that we come from, the context that First Nations people and different First Nations groups are coming from, and ultimately, it's an amalgam of all of these things that kind of come together, which spells out what that overall kind of picture looks like, or what that narrative is. But for instance, our systems need to be more understanding and flexible in terms of interpretation. So I'll give a classic example. So you've got so many First Nations elders in particular and traditional owners in Australia who undertake work on country, on the land, and that's often unpaid for. But in our statistics, because it's unpaid for, they're considered unemployed, right? And so we look at it from an unemployment lens as opposed to thinking about it from, well, these guys are creating so much value, so much broader value, and it's unpaid for. Like, as opposed to rewarding that, we can be quite punitive in our policy frameworks
That's
when
exactly what I was talking about.
Exactly.
It's
So,
it's that whole context, it's that whole understanding of the importance and who is it that gets to say which is important, or whose ethics you're using, or whose values are being placed on that data. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. And so, it comes to a better relational understanding between peoples, but also relationality with land and the spaces that we're occupying as well. And those kinds of thoughts, they're very advanced thoughts. They're not embedded in a lot of our governance systems in Australia. Certainly, I'm not sure about in Aotearoa, but certainly it's something that's quite new in an Australian context. It starts with people, but then it has to grow broader than that.
Yeah, exactly. And we have some questions in the chat, but before I open to the Q&A, I just wanted to ask Stephen a question about um, your work at Kiwa Digital is kind of the interface of like technology and digital platforms, but also Indigenous knowledge as well. So I was wondering how, in this context, you see that technology can enable data sovereignty without like commodifying or extracting Indigenous knowledge. So how do you see that relationship, and how does that play out in the work that you're doing?
I think it echoes everything that Lisa and Sid have shared, is that the starting point has to be the Indigenous community and their view of the world. In New Zealand, we talk about Te Ao Māori, the Māori world, and there are values related to that. An interesting point, once you start really digging into the stuff, you get into language issues. So just the term data. So what does data mean for an English-speaking person versus someone from an Indigenous background?
Yeah, we even have this. Sorry, Stephen, we have this question in the chat. What is data? And
so with because I'm part Scottish as well as Māori, with my Te Ao Māori hat on, we would talk about taonga being the equivalent of treasure. So suddenly we've gone from this very clinical idea, an algorithm, data, and now we're talking about taonga, our treasures. So there's a hell of a lot more emotion and connection, social stuff connected to that word versus data. So if you sort of shift the definition back to what the Indigenous, in our case, hapu iwi, tribe, sub-tribe, whānau, New Zealand, if the start of the conversation is there, then you start, the technology is at the end. And Lisa sort of already shared this in a highly detailed way. What we try to do, being a technology company, is try to ensure, because we're usually working with the Indigenous folks, and I'd like to think we're their kaitiaki from the world, some of them being the big tech companies. And so we're trying to get in there and build trust and understand what their aspirations are from a language perspective, from a data share, whatever it might be. And then go, cool. Before we jump into the mechanics, let's think about what your tikanga is, your protocols, your policies, right? So I'm using the word tikanga alongside the word policy. So what are your value-based behaviours around your taonga? So I've gone right back again, and then I unpack it back into English, and I haven't even got into technical developer terms yet. That'll come later. So we're constantly going back to the source to ensure that, are we actually talking the same language? No pun intended. It takes a little bit more. There's more meetings, more hui, as we'd say, to get that point done. And the same with First Nations, because I'm doing work in Australia. But those conversations, as disjointed they might feel, if you're a very technical person, you go and think, oh my goodness, what the hell are you doing this for? That's where the gold is. And you spend the time there, and then you bring that forward with them. You bring them forward into the next steps. You get into all this other wonderful stuff. So I'm not sure if that answered correctly. That's literally what we do. Get down, kānohi ki te kānohi, face to face, and just listen. Do as much listening as you can of what they really want, and make sure they understand your version of that as the techie folks, and that they feel safe and they trust you to take them on the journey. And if you're like Kiwa Digital me, the responsibility of that, these people are putting their centuries of knowledge and insight in my hands, metaphorically speaking. That's a big responsibility to take on board. And so I think a lot of the tech companies that are in that cultural space are starting to go, whoa, I felt less responsible when I was over this side, but when I'm really close to the people, I've got to answer to my nannies, my uncles, if I screw up. So just having that deep sense of, responsibility, accountability, you'll figure it out.
Yeah, and I think just to add to Stephen's point there, that responsibility, the way in which he spoke about it, taking that responsibility, it harkens to a term we don't often use in a data and in a research or a policy context, and that is sacred. Like, how do we treat information as sacred and treat it with respect, and treat the people who have that knowledge with respect? And that's an uncomfortable space. Like, these are uncomfortable words for people like myself who've worked in government their whole lives to kind of deal with and grapple with. But I think it's a really critical concept that we need to kind of bring into this whole area.
Agreed. I think the flip side of that as well is who will be harmed, if it's not done properly. They're the sort of questions that my company asks. In fact, there's three key questions. Who gave you permission to use the data? Who has authority over the data whilst it's being used? And who has authority to stop it being used whilst it's in motion? Because if you are not sure who should have the permission or the authority, who is going to be harmed by it should it not be done correctly? And I think those are also uncomfortable questions that absolutely must be looked into, because all we're doing otherwise is creating harm, and generational harm at that.
Yeah, exactly. And Stephen, with the points you were making, not to put you on the spot, but can you maybe provide some kind of concrete examples of where you've seen these practices being implemented,
It's a really easy one. So in the Māori culture, we have a thing called karakia, which you could translate into prayers. And when you're working with certain groups, there are certain karakias they do not want out in the public domain. They want them, sure, archived, stored appropriately with text and audio and so forth. And so when we're working with those communities, that'd be one of the early discussions of which karakia are going to be with the immediate community, and then potentially in the wider community. Another big one that comes up is genealogy. So there's this sort of catch of we're all trying to find our identity and say, I relate to the Ngāpuhi tribe and all that sort of stuff, and to be able to do that is an amazing journey, and your whakapapa. Once we start getting discussions of how that might be stored to help validate that Steve Renata really is Ngāpuhi descent and whatever, and if by doing that he is then entitled to certain things, scholarships and whatever. It's an interesting beast, the genealogy part, what we call whakapapa, of how it should be collected by consent, of course, validated, and then maybe shared in whatever ways is appropriate. And so, great big conversation. It's kind of exciting, but very quickly you get into all the issues that Lisa and Sid have raised. And so, if you've done a really good job of getting the community engaged enough to get that data stored in a whatever the portal might be, there's some pretty big conversations that need to have started or taking place immediately to ensure that to Lisa's point, no harm will come from that genealogy data because it's incredibly sacred, precious, or we would say tapu. So again, a lot more meetings, a lot more conversations to get to that rock solid policy that is going to protect those Indigenous folks with that particular part of their data.
And that leads into one of the questions in the chat. If we're thinking concretely about your own context, we have someone that asked, what concrete steps can your regional government first take to implement or embed the principles we're talking about in their data collection? So what first actions need to be taken? So if you're thinking about your own context, how would you speak to your regional, subnational government and the advice that you would ask or give to them for moving forward on actually enacting what we're discussing here today? That's for anyone to answer.
I'll have a stab at it from our perspective. So there is a lot of legislation in the Australian context for protection of people's data. And in particular for our IBA customers, like having customers who have identified as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander, that's actually protected by secrecy provisions. So someone like myself could go to jail for illicit kind of disclosure of information. The risk is, though, when the focus is on protection as opposed to empowerment, you get a lethargy that builds into decision makers and policymakers and researchers, and they're like, I just don't want to deal with those risks because they're just too great. And so I'm not going to do anything with this information. I'm not going to do anything with this data. And that can be the real travesty. Now, that might actually be a good thing in some respects, in certain contexts, but it can also be quite limiting because you're actually also you're going against what we're trying to get at with data sovereignty principles, and that is, but by allowing the legislative frameworks to kind of, if they're not calibrated appropriately, to shackle the utilisation, then you're actually disempowering yourself, but also communities around you, and you're making it harder for them to be able to access and get into using that knowledge and that data. So I think it's really important to be able to look at your legislative and other regulatory frameworks and see, well, to what extent is it enabling and what extent is it disabling in the first instance, and then how can you then turn that into empowering for communities to utilise? And how do you seed that sovereignty over that data that has been collected by your organisation or your government or Bureau of Statistics or whoever, and make it owned and controlled in some meaningful way to the authority of First Nations people? It's a challenging thing. I don't know if there are practical steps, but I think that's the direction it kind of has to go.
I think for me, it comes down to a seat at the table. I think when we have a look at our privacy laws in Aotearoa, Australia, Canada, they're all reasonably similar, but they have not been done. They have not been made for Indigenous people. When I think we look at Indigenous people, we're talking about a collective. We're talking about tribes. We're talking about mobs. We're talking about iwi hapu. And privacy laws are based on individuals. So that in itself kind of reneges everything that kind of is happening right now. So for me, foundationally, it would be a seat at the table. If we want to start really looking into how we can do this, then we need to have Indigenous people sitting with lawmakers and decision makers and policy makers to be able to have the conversations around that, because right now we have laws and we have policies and we have documents and we have governance, and it all sounds great, but it actually has been designed from a political lens rather than from Indigenous people.
I'm not sure, Stephen, maybe you have some perspectives on this. Otherwise, there are some.
You got two gurus here. I'll just go with the four practical versions of that. Number one, get your governance piece in before collection, not after. Two, move from consultation to shared decision rights. So make sure the communities are the ones who are defining what data is collected, success indicators, what could be linked, etc. Three, and this often gets missed, and it's to Lisa's point, having Indigenous at the table, invest in Indigenous capability. Let's have the analysts and stewards and governance bodies and developers that are Indigenous as qualified as well, but at the table. And then the fourth one is, should you have done all those, is move away, if you already are, from deficit-only reporting and get into strength-based and community-relevant indicators. I don't want to hear about how many Māoris are alcoholics. I want to hear about who's fit. What's the wellbeing status?
100%.
We all know the negatives, right? It's an old saying in life: you get what you focus on. So if you keep serving up deficit, guess what? You'll get it. The prophecy will come through. If you start showing pockets of positiveness, there's a Māori word for te kakano, the seed. All we need is a seed of positive data that says it's possible. If it can be done once, it can be done again. And so, that's a little bit of a psychological shift as well. Let's serve up all the negative stuff about the Indigenous folks and look how hopeless they are. Come on. You got to flip the switch here because we can do it.
Right.
We navigate
Absolutely.
it. Right?
Absolutely right, and the deficit discourse is something that, from an Australian policy context, that the Australian government and academics and others have tried to turn around, and there's been a sharper focus on talking about the success stories, and that's certainly a big element of the research that we do, and the impact research in particular that we kind of focus on. Talk about the stories of intergenerational change, talk about the stories of long-term stability and success that our customers experience. And I think it's really critical that when we are talking, though, about where things where there are shortcomings, you assign the appropriate accountability. Like when there's reporting about lower birth weights for certain groups of children compared to others, or a lower educational attainment or something like that. Firstly, you've got to put it into historical context. Secondly, you've got to be able to also take the next step in the research and actually assign the problems, right? Like a lot of the issues that are symptoms, they're symptomatic of structural marginalization that's happened over very, very long periods of time. And unfortunately, researchers either don't have access, or they just focus on the outcomes but don't look at the correlations and the causation of what's really underlying the challenges. So thinking about data that can speak to discriminatory views or biases, and there is data out there that looks at this, but it requires researchers to be brave enough to be able to undertake that work. So assign the accountability to where it lies. Don't blame the people who are being marginalised and disadvantaged for their circumstances and their situation.
Yeah, that's a really great point on the deficit discourse. We're running out of time, unfortunately. A very interesting discussion. I'm sure we could speak for hours about it. There's a couple of more technical questions in the chat that are aimed at Stephen regarding the platforms that are used to store Indigenous data and Maori data specifically as well. Specifically, people are mentioning AWS in the chat, so maybe you could provide a couple of minutes your perspective on kind of choosing the systems to store the data, how you embed these principles you're talking about today on data sovereignty when you're using some of these platforms.
Yeah, there's a lot of different options out there. The fact that we used AWS is, whatever it is, Microsoft do a great job, and there are others. Trying to keep this technical conversation relatively simple, you really kind of got two avenues. One is you can have your data stored locally, so on your device, on a USB stick, whoever's got the latest laptop or whatever, and you might have your own server. And for some people, that would feel the most secure. I can touch it, feel, I can see it's right there. However, in a lot of the things that we have in life today, people are looking for cloud-based solutions because cloud provides a whole lot of benefits. Once you get into the cloud discussion, there are things that you need to understand. And again, just trying to keep this simple. If you're with one of the big tech companies, one of the first questions you're going to ask is, where is the data actually stored? So if we're working with Māori in New Zealand, is the AWS data stored in New Zealand? It is now. I've got a data centre here in Auckland. Previously, it was in Australia. And so why is that a big deal? Because the laws of the country are around where the data is stored. So if it's in Australia, which is a great place, by the way, I love Australia, it's Australian law that would be across Māori data, and there's a conflict straight away, and vice versa. So where is the data stored? Where is the data center if you're using one of the big tech companies? From there, then you get into some pretty technical discussions around the security of those particular applications. One that comes very quickly is the metadata, so the title and the tags and the description and whatever other metadata fields that you've got for each field. Does the system that you're going to use do that for you, or protect it, or enhance it, or allow you to customize it? Critical discussion point to have with whoever your provider might be for the storage. And I could go on and on, but I think the first one is, are you going to go local? That's great. Do you have a cloud aspiration? If you do, and you go with one of the big tech companies, where is their data center? Is it in your country? If it is, that's a good tick to start with. And then you progress from there. That would probably be the fundamental questions that I would suggest people ask. And I'm not here to promote AWS by any stretch of the imagination. I will say this for those that have strong views, perhaps politically. With the big US tech companies, there's what I think called the US Cloud Act, which in simple terms is that if the administration decide they want to pull that data, there is a lot of power in their mandate. If you are a New Zealand company using that service on one of those big companies and that act came out, what's our risk mitigation? What you can do is ensure that the encryption codes are done by the Indigenous community, which will block what they want. It's not a full solution, but it's a big risk mitigation to have to deal with the possibility of that US Cloud Act, which very rarely ever gets activated, but we live in volatile times, so I don't want to just wishy-washy that. That's something to look at very carefully with any cloud pieces. If it's a big tech company from the States, check the US Cloud Act and what that actually means and how can you mitigate the potential of that coming in.
Yeah, and I imagine for policymakers would be kind of enabling this expertise to exist within Indigenous communities so that they can conduct this risk assessments, on their own, for their own data in their own communities, and ask these questions when they're choosing which platforms to trust. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I might just quickly ask each of you to provide maybe one sentence of your main kind of point that you want people to take away from today, and especially in the context of kind of building an international agenda as well on this topic. So maybe we start with Lisa.
Thank you. So my one thing would be that if you're governance policy does not talk about Indigenous Data Authority, then it's actually not governance, it's just a document with intent.
And Sid?
What I would say is it's really critical that we recognise that frameworks in and of themselves can't do very much unless there are people who are willing to actually stand by some of these principles and push through. So sometimes it means pushing up a massive rock uphill. And that's fine, that's okay. You will end up having support, and people will come when they recognise what you're trying to do in that space, and to drive the direction of moving away from just protection of people's data towards empowerment of communities utilising that data.
Thanks, Sid. And Stephen?
And complimenting my expert leaders here, I think key lesson for us is that Indigenous data sovereignty works best when it's not treated as a specialist add-on. The best examples where you see Indigenous governance is where it's built into the rules of the system, the design of the data process, and the capability of the institutions involved. So everything that we talked about earlier is you got to have the whānau connected and sharing their view of what's going on, and take them on the journey all the way through, and trust and never forget, if you're a policymaker, you've got something sitting on your shoulders. It's called responsibility, and that's a lifetime thing. Kia ora.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you for that. So thank you so much to all our panelists today. It was a really interesting discussion. We are hoping to do more of a series on this topic across different geographies. So today was more focused on Australia and New Zealand. But I see a question in the chat already about the Sami people in Europe. So I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the Q&As today, but thank you to everyone that joined the webinar today. You'll be able to find the recording on our website, which has been posted in the chat. And you can also find the link to sign up to our mailing list, where you'll get more information about the next webinars that we'll do on this topic and other related topics for Indigenous communities. So thank you, everyone, today. Really appreciate it, and have a great day or evening wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.